My name is Taharka Ade. I'm a professor in the Department of Africana Studies at San Diego State University.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi A14, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started with today's episode. A day we are talking Africa. That already sounds to me now as if I'm talking to a brother that we're coming from the same country. A day, is that a Nigerian name or what?
That is it's a Yoruba.
Okay.
Yeah.
I cannot forget to recognize that is my brother's name. All right, Mr. Ade. Tell me a little bit about your background. This is where we start from, because this is a project that is a little bit particular, because this is about African diaspora. And as African diaspora, we are very proud of our history, where we are coming from. We usually start from there, knowing who you are. So tell me a little bit about you, your childhood growing up.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town known as Mount Vernon, Alabama. It's about 30 miles north of Mobile, Alabama, in the United States. And I tell people now, of course, I didn't realize it then, but it was definitely very much an African village. It was all Black town. We had very respected members of society, Black mayors and things of that nature. Very self-contained town, very proud people. My grandfather was a history teacher for 33 years, a high school history teacher. And so he was the first to teach me Afro-American history and African history, Africana history. So I learned a lot of things, a great deal under him. Did not think I wanted to go into history as a child. I think I was just overwhelmed with it. But as I got older, I started to see it as a responsibility and really a duty to ancestors.
Do you want to say anything as to what, because at the initial you didn't want to go into like be a teacher of history, be a lecturer of history. Today you are. Is there anything in the course of your growing up that sort of push you into doing that?
I guess there were a number of things. So I attended a historically Black high school. I attended a historically Black college, Alabama State University. And in those settings, I was blessed to have professors and teachers who cared a lot about me, wanted me to really understand historical significance of various things that have happened to people of African descent in this country. So I started off when I went to college in political science. I thought maybe I wanted to be an attorney. And I learned very quickly in political science what I really actually loved was history. And I think, just taking up the baton from my grandfather, really, but many of the professors who were there, they encouraged the push in that direction. And so I had a lot of community that understood my gift for history.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. You see, you and I now, if you didn't say you're in the United States, it would appear as if we are just the close neighbor. We are somewhere in Africa now because we are these are just two brothers talking, only that we are separated by a long distance and also a history that sometimes it is sad, but sometimes that is the way it is, no? But at the end of the day, we understand that, okay, these are brothers here. All right, now, help me understand it. A young boy growing up in the United States, how much access does he have to know about African history? I mean, about the root now.
Today, perhaps a lot of access. When I was growing up, however, the internet was just created around the time I was born. So it was in its infantile stage. So wasn't much you could learn on there. And today you still have to be very careful, right, about the internet. But so I think I was fortunate to have a grandfather who was a history teacher, and he had a huge collection of books and encyclopedias. The first time I learned about my namesake, Taharka, it was the first king of African history that I learned about. And I learned from my grandfather. He pointed them out to me in an encyclopedia. And so I was able to learn African history that way, but a lot of people perhaps didn't have, well, I know didn't have the same amount of fortune. However, when I think about my high school, for example, since it was a historically Black high school and we had 90% Black teachers, they would try to impart at least a lot of African American history on people. But in terms of, African history itself, I seem to recall the library had murals of ancient Egyptian murals in it. There might have been some murals of Zulu culture, things of that nature, in the library. But there was different African things of African aesthetic that was painted or placed somewhere in a classroom or things of that nature. So we had kind of that surrounding, but it doesn't mean you have, really the ideological reinforcement to really understand the aesthetics that you're being surrounded with and what they mean to you. When I was in school, derogatory terms towards African people or people who looked maybe too dark was still popular. And so, it was, you had this very strange setting that we're all in this society that tries to create this notion of the inferiority of anything African: culture, language, aesthetic, the corporeal, the way people look. It's still to this day being pushed, but definitely when I was in school, it was a huge thing.
That is important. Now, you say your grandfather was a history teacher. Of course, that helps us understand now where you would have gotten most of the information from, at least from the family, because the thing is in the family now. So, what was your grandfather teaching? Was it of a specific topic in history, or was it a kind of a general African history?
No, he was a high school history teacher, so he had to teach what was kind of mandated by the school system. But from what I recall him saying, he passed back in 2012, so he's no longer with us. But from what I recall him saying, he would make sure to slip in as much African American and African history as he could into the curriculum, and his students to this day tell me they loved him for it. So
thank you so much for that. And now this is the last question I'm asking you in the early age before we move to what you are doing today. Now, when you were still growing up now as a young man, you had a conversation. You listened to what your father told you. Of course, you were highly blessed, to have a grandfather who understands history. Because that is where most of the manipulation actually is done. No, they try to take you away from your roots, so you are on the surface now. So the wind can blow you to any level. But if you have a father now who tell you this is your root, it make sure that you are planted on the ground, so the wind doesn't make you fall. Now, when you go around and have a conversation with regular other guys in town, how does that affect you? What difference does it make in the kind of conversation that you make with people?
So when I was a good deal younger, I was still am very passionate, but passionate in a way that I didn't know how to really bring up conversations without being kind of overly forceful about it in terms, conversations in terms of, African history or racism or anything like that. So I would just talk about things in sometimes in the wrong atmosphere, in the wrong time. And sometimes, very few times, that was taken as refreshing. And other times, or most times, it was kind of like, hey, we're relaxing over here, don't bring that around right now. But as I got older and as they've gotten older, people who I was close with and people who I uh, really drifted away from. Even some of them have come back and say, hey, you used to talk about many of these things when we were younger. Can you bring them up again? What did you mean when you said this or that?
Now, you are a history lecturer, not just of a lower level, but of a higher level, and that is very important. And now we know where you are coming from. We know that this is something this is something of the family. You love to do it, almost like your grandfather now, like a kind of obligation to teach this knowledge to the younger generation, so they can find their root on the ground. This is very, very important now. So, what is your area of concentration in history?
So I primarily focus on African civilization, and my specific area of research is cultural continuity. So I'm looking at, more particularly in this time, African Americans and the vestige of culture, of African culture that still remains with us, and trying to trace those elements back to various aspects of the African continent, or to various areas on the African continent, wherever they may have come from. And with that, I'm developing what I'm calling antecedent methodology. What are the antecedents to various things that African Americans have? And perhaps even if we trace it back to the history of where it came from, or the initial launch from Africa to the Americas, can we trace that even further back from those areas? So that's the kind of things I look at.
Now, let's first of all take the African civilization. What do you want people to know about African civilization? Because now you are the lecturer of that. You are the one teaching children. So what would you really want people to know about African civilization?
That African had a history, has a history, and still has a history. And that when learning about African history, you should always learn from the perspectives of African people as best as you can. That due to colonialism, and not just people of African descent, but people of many different ethnicities, but I focus on African people, have been decentered ideologically and culturally. And that decentering has also allowed the Western world to create their own narratives of what African history is and who African people are. And so, and really what history is. What does history mean? What does language mean? What does culture mean? What does it mean to be modern? Those kinds of things, those kind of ideologies are colonized as well by the Western world. And so those are kind of aspects when it comes to African history, I try to get people to understand.
Okay, so I'm going to throw back the question to you that you put out there. You were asking, what does history mean? A couple of days ago, I was interviewing a Nigerian philosopher, so we were talking about language, and I find it very interesting how he tried to analyze it. Now we're in history. So what does it even mean, history? What does it mean when we talk about history? Why should somebody spend time try to learn about history?
Well, history, to use the old cliche, if you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it, right? History will tell you what things in your immediate future, or in your present, but also in your immediate future, are going to come to pass simply by what has happened before. And it also is a center of strength for people of whatever your background is. To understand and know your history is perhaps one of the most powerful things for a group of people in the world. And we know this because when you go into, or at least those of us who are in Western countries or in colonized areas, when you're having to learn, Western, or you're going through a Western education system, you're taught history and you're taught their history, right? And it's something that is valorized, and it's given as something that should be thought of as the standard for, historical things. You learn that supposedly Isaac Newton invented calculus, although we know that calculus was before Newton in various different types and very different places of the world. We know of early calculus in China, early types of calculus in India. But according to the West, calculus starting with Isaac Newton, right? And so it valorizes the people that they want to valorize. It deifies, really, the people that they want to deify in their own history. And so once that occurs and you teach that to people who are outside of your cultural center, who are outside of your culture, who you are dominating, who you are colonizing, then whatever they are to themselves starts to become an inferior thing, and whatever you are is superior. So they want to seek your superiority and seek to emulate it, and it's, that's a horrible thing. Once you teach yourself your own history and you understand your own history from your own perspective, because it's not just a thing of learning your history. The West has continuously tried to present their notion of what our history is. The supposed famous or the supposed brilliant philosopher Hegel, right? When he talked of African history, he said Africa essentially has no history, at least nothing north of the Saharan border. Nothing south of the Saharan border. The only thing would be Egypt. And when he talks of Egypt, he talks of Egypt as if it shares more of a cultural center with Europe and with the East. But then he says that there's still this clearly childlike nature in Egyptian society that must have been influenced by these African people, and that's something that's not good for Egypt. So for centuries, people followed that and said, oh, well, Africa is the dark continent. It has no real history. All the people there are childlike. And when people were taken from the African continent and taught that same type of information, they're of African descent themselves, they're African people, but they're being taught that their history is a history of savages and that they come from a history of savages. And how else are people to interpret that other than I must be an inferior person to these people who are teaching this information?
Now, we got a point that we're going to separate the conversation on. To start with, that it is not just neutral story that we're talking about here. That when a child doesn't know anything, a child have gone to school, instead of having a broad view of a subject, he only get a narrow view. It's not by accident. It's part of the product of the educational system, and therefore the structure of the education. So if a lot of Africa went to European school and they don't know anything about African history, in terms of the detail of African history, it is not by accident. So thank you for that clarification.
Absolutely.
Now, as a historian, could you please give me a description? What do you mean by Afrocentrism? So that at least you help us to set a background here.
Okay, so I'm not a practitioner of Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism it was a term that was created by detractors of the real term, which is Afrocentricity. Okay, so Afrocentricity is what I use, is my methodology I use in my research, and it's essentially it's a theory of agency, right? And it is this idea that African people must view themselves and also be viewed as agents rather than spectators in their own history, in history in general, and as well as in contemporary matters. Afrocentrism, that term is kind of generally being used to describe kind of a broad cultural movement of people who have anything to do with, anything that seems coming from Africa or or whatever, but it's not always a scholarly input on things that are of African matters. It's just something that it's kind of a straw man argument. It's something that people use when they talk against Afrocentricity in order to lump Afrocentricity into this broad notion of unscholarly work. So I don't use Afrocentrism. What I use is Afrocentricity.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that clarification. All right. Now, when people say Africans have no history, like you just pointed out in your explanation, what comes to your mind as a reaction to a statement like that? Because this is not something that was said in some random places. This was said by some of the biggest European scholars at the time, and it was widely heard as a view. So as a historian, an African historian who was looking at history from a different perspective than the European, what is your reaction?
I suppose the first reaction is what kind of ego does Europe have to suggest that a people who has been around for thousands of years, even when the anthropologists began to do their work in Europe and began to understand just how long, even by let's just say the 1960s or 70s, when they began to understand just how long people have been on Earth and just how long people have lived in various geographical locales, and to still suggest or to still allow the suggestion that people can live in various areas for thousands of years and not have formed their own processes of culture and history and what it means to them to be a modern people from their own perspective. People think of modern things or modernism by technology, but that's how the Western world has allowed us to perceive things that are modern. Modern can really just be in the line of ideas or just culture or how people in contemporary society view their contemporary society. But regardless of that, what I think of is that the second thing is that we have a lot of work to do in order to upend these ridiculous notions, to upend colonial ideas, and to restore and recenter African people.
Okay. Now, by history itself, of course, I do not subscribe to the fact that we need to expect the European to tell the African story. I've said it a number of times. I've interviewed some professors here, even European professors, and I've told them that is not your job. The job is for other people. That is the African people. Because like Dr. Ben was saying, there is too much involved in the telling of a story that European just cannot tell the African story. Point.
Absolutely.
Full stop. All right. Now, when we talk of history, let's try to even romanticize the story that Africa have no story. Okay, fine. We got it. What do they really mean by story? What do you need to demonstrate that there is a story?
So in the field of history, now there's quite a few now who try to break out of this paradigm, right? But in the Eurocentric field of history, in their discipline, which I began in my bachelor's degree, so I know a little bit about, there was this bifurcation of time known as prehistory and history, right? And prehistory was largely dependent upon the notion that people had not began writing, right? So if there's no writing to be spoken of, then that has been discovered, then that's prehistoric. And in the moment that people began writing and documenting history, supposedly is history. It's going towards the more modern era of the time spectrum, right? Which to me has always been a ridiculous notion. What societies would always need, or what would be the need for every society on earth to develop a writing system? Particularly, what would be the need of smaller societies, smaller groups who do very well communicating among themselves, or even small groups within larger clans or whatever have you, who do very well communicating within themselves orally, absolutely need to write, that have, or groups that have traditions, oral traditions, right, of passing down history, would not necessarily need writing. That doesn't mean that various groups did not create writing, right? But and didn't have it alongside, or their oral traditions and things of that nature. But to suggest that writing is the end all be all of civilization is kind of a ridiculous notion. And so because Europeans were going to the African continent and not discovering, papyrus in West Africa, so, which, by the way, you have to consider that the climate of various parts of West Africa going down towards the south might not always allow for various things to be preserved. So there could have been writing there from centuries ago, that just was not preserved well, or haven't been preserved at all, and people haven't discovered because the climate doesn't really allow for it. When you go to Egypt, it's a very arid climate. You can find many things because it's capable of preserving various material culture like that. So there's that thing. But regardless of that, to suggest that writing is the end all be all of civilization and where history begins, as I stated before, it's just ridiculous. But that is where that assertion comes from, and that is what's been perpetuated throughout the world.
Thank you for that. All right, now the assertion actually have different dimensions that need explanation sometime. Okay, now let's even give it to the European that Egypt is not Africa. I get it. This is another way of saying Italy is not a European country because it's a Mediterranean country, okay? But even though that is actually contradictory, because there is nothing in the Mediterranean that say that because you are on this side of the ocean, you are no longer part of that land.
Right.
Anyway, to a European, he will see that you don't make any sense saying that Italy is not a European country. But for them, it makes sense perfectly to say, well, Egypt is not an Africa, even though it's actually Africa in every sense of it. Okay, now let's give it to them. Fine. Europe, you are Africans. The Israelites built the pyramid. They first of all were not in existence. They built the pyramid, then they disappeared from existence. Then they came out in existence after I don't know how they managed to convince the people. Is it because people were just too ignorant in the world that people didn't ask questions? I don't even understand it. Let's even give it to them that Egypt is not even in Africa because we are looking at writing now. Now, let's look at Sudan, Nubia, which is just a neighbor because, okay, in Nubia, the pyramid there, in the text, in the shrine, in the places of worship, there are texts. Is it not true? Those things have been there for, those one doesn't represent text, or those people, the first European who were recording the word, they really discovered that there were things there. So I'm trying to understand how they managed to convince that in Africa there was no writing, therefore there is no history. They didn't see it. They were not able to see it, or they just ignore it. Nobody talked of ancient Zimbabwe. Because that is made of paper. Help me.
Zimbabwe, huge stone palaces and things of that nature, which, interestingly, when you talk of Zimbabwe, there was someone by the name of, I don't recall if I got it out of Saul DeBoe's book or from Basil Davison, but at one time, there was some suggestion that writing was discovered in Zimbabwe, and maybe it's sitting in whatever they found, some kind of slate, maybe it's sitting in someone's closet right now, because during the colonial era, they just took a lot of things out of there. Right. But, what is it that we consider writing? I would challenge people to break out of their own paradigms of what writing is. Is not art a form of communication, or what we consider just art itself? and you find art all over the African continent, right? And it means different things to different people. It means a particular thing to the people who created the art in the first place, and to the culture that they come from and the society that they lived in, that communicates something, that means something. And so, that in itself is a form of writing. That's a form of, that's civilization, that's, high culture. But we're often left with this notion that, whatever Europe says is a certain thing, that's what it is. And so if it doesn't meet European standard, then, that's where we are.
When they wanted to write the Bible, no? Take up the Quran or the Bible, you look at it, this is purely an idea that is coming from Africa, not just the idea, but even some of the text in it have actually been copied, just simply copied. Now, if Europeans were advanced as they pretend that they were, they would not need to use African to form their religion. They would just simply put their religion there. For the fact that the 10 Commandments were taken out from the 42 negative confessions that have been there for thousands of years, just simply tells you that was the order of the day. Moses didn't know that there was the 42 negative confession before he went to the mountain.
Well, where did those 42 negative confessions come from? They came from Egypt, right? And Egypt is European, right? They had to make Egypt white, in order to explain this. But not just Egypt, Martin Luther King actually wrote a paper when he was in grad school. It was two, one on Mithra, but the other is basically just called the mystery religions. And he mentions Asar and Aset, or Isis and Horus and Osiris, as the Greeks called them. But he mentions them in his paper. But he also goes on to mention how Christianity in itself was a collection of many different Mediterranean faiths. So, not just Egypt, but also Zoroastrianism and various other things. But, and of course, like the Greek Dionysus and various others. But, and it's very interesting because it's almost as if the Greeks and the Romans knew this themselves, because and of course they did, right? Because when you look at, let's take Isis, for example, Aset, right? A goddess is created by the name of Isis. But at the same time, the knowledge or the understanding that there is an Egyptian Aset exists too. It's like, okay, so you took this deity and you made it your own, but you still acknowledge the existence of the other. It shows the amount of confusion and a willingness to copy people's culture, and because of their own power at the time, not really care about what other people thought of it. It's like, well, it's ours now. But that, by the time of the Roman era, just became a very type of ethos of European ideology, just to bring in various people's culture, their spiritual culture, their even their history and language and myths and all these different things, to bring it in and then rebrand it as something that is European. There's a book, De Souza Santos, and it's called Epistemologies of the South, and he's basically admitting this, that this has been kind of the Eurocentric ethos, is to raid the epistemologies, raid the cultures, the cultural ideas of the South, and then rebrand it as something that is European.
Now, I'm just reflecting, I'm just thinking aloud. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that the people in the ancient, they knew perfectly what they were doing, who they were dealing with. Today, many Europeans, I say this one often, they literally think that they are seeing Africa for the first times. Many Europeans, including those that are in Italy, they literally think that the past 20 years, the outbreak of immigration, because they will ask questions like, do your father live on top of the tree? Something as horrible as that. Somebody have said it in this generation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what I believe, I mean, it's just my belief, maybe I'm wrong on it, let me say it, is that at the time this culture were missing of course, the high culture was actually Africa. There is no doubt about it, because the Greek, who are the father of Western civilization, didn't go to Africa as master. They went there as students to learn. Because where would you go to if you want to learn? Say, for example, many Africans today would like to come to the West to learn because their institutions have been destroyed. They are basically on the ground. That is just the way it is. Now, I think when this was happening, the Europeans could not imagine that they were going to be the Lord of this world. Because if they knew, they would have done it differently. They were simply taking what is the order of the day. That is why they will build obelisks in different parts of Europe. Because that was the symbol. That was what everybody knew. Even though when we look at it, we see that it's coming from somewhere. Because if you were so powerful, if you were really sophisticated as it were, you wouldn't take something that is of people of less importance and bring it to your home, in their religion, in their worship, in their language. You wouldn't do that.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you want to say anything to that effect, or maybe I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It was a huge inferiority complex that Europe went through, and particularly Greece and Rome. And when we're talking about that time, because it has happened several times since then, the raiding of people's cultural artifacts and their cultural ideology, and then rebranding it as something that's yours, and it was justified by conquering, right? It was justified by this notion that because of the Ptolemaic dynasty, right? That means that all of Egypt was European, right? Or at least you can brand it that way. You can have Elizabeth Taylor play Cleopatra on television, and regardless of Cleopatra's past. But why Cleopatra? That's the question. Why not some of the older stories of the actual dynastic eras of Kemetic culture or ancient Egyptian culture? Why not focus on those? Well, because the more you focus on those, the darker the people are going to be. and so let's deal with these Ptolemies and this classical era, right? Because that is European classics. Although they're trying to push this narrative that what is classical is the standard of human civilization. No, that's just your classical history. Just as what was occurring in the Nile Valley was African classical history.
There are this just simple common sense that people don't want to apply. Okay, so Egypt is a Western civilization. Okay, fine. Let's say they are Italians, people coming from Germany or from the Caucasus Mountain. Fine, beautiful. But what drove you from the Caucasus Mountain to Africa to establish your civilization and then return back to the Caucasus Mountain? Is it not common sense? Okay, they came from Germany, Austria, beautiful. From France, we got it because they left France. What is the evidence of them leaving there to Egypt and then returning? Why do you? I think it's a common sense, but people don't ask questions, or maybe I'm just asking too many questions.
How do you make sure that African history is not of someone else's construction, right? That you're making sure that African history is being done in a correct way, in an Afrocentric way, in a way that African people and agency. The agency of African people is being considered.
All right, but this agency, what exactly do you mean?
So agency is when a person acts on their own behalf, right? So generally, how history is done is or when African history is written, it's and written by the West, I should say. It's in this way, as if there's something to be discovered in Africa, either someone from the outside came in and built it, or African people did it by happenstance, or it was some magic miracle, or in in today's society, aliens came down and built it for them. And so, it's something that cannot be explained by these ignorant natives who we have found here, quote unquote, right? And so you mentioned Zimbabwe. Let's take in Zimbabwe, for example, and we can mix in the Bible with that. So in the United States, and just to be clear for all listeners, in the United States, we know of this notion of the curse of Ham, right? That Ham cursed Noah, that Noah cursed Ham, and that all his descendants were black of skin, and that in the United States, that justified enslavement, that justified slavery. In other parts of the Western world, however, that took some other interesting areas, whereas in other parts of the world, particularly in Britain and other areas, Africans are not even considered in the Bible. So, you couldn't be talking about African people. So what certain anthropologists, when it came to Zimbabwe, thought was going on was that Zimbabwe must have been built by some lesser Europeans, maybe the, cursed descendants of Ham, who came into the African continent and then built Zimbabwe. And that would justify settler colonialism in Zimbabwe. That would justify Europeans being there.
Probably also maybe the ancient city of Benin, the ancient war of Benin. So there is this strange people that are just walking around in Africa doing something for the African people.
When you mentioned Benin, think of what was his name? There was a person who came to Benin. His name will come to me at some point, but he comes to Benin and he sees the city and he says, wow, this must be the ancient city of Atlantis. And he takes this story and he brings it back, and this is the early 20th century. He takes the story, he brings it back to the West, and it's printed all over newspapers that Atlantis is really in this city inhabited by these ignorant people, and they don't know what they're doing inhabiting the city. Now, the folly of Europe and the Western world is that even if they believe that, then Britain goes in and burns the whole city to the ground. So it's it's just ridiculous what the West has conceived when it comes to African people.
How simple is it even for historians to dig up African history? Because now, I think what is happening is that we have a competitor who have helped us to destroy everything we have so that their narration can be the only one that exists. For our mistake, for our error, sometimes we tell them, but add us to your narration so that we can be there too. But it's not going to happen. They cannot add us to their narration. First of all, they're not even the one to narrate our story. Mm-hmm. So it means the work now becomes even harder for us. Because some of those documents that have been destroyed to justify their exploitation of us, mm-hmm. we're going to have to find them. How easy it is. Because if we don't, we run the risk of our children believing that really we have no history. I tell you, I have seen here in Italy again, this one is an African student, a young child that was born here, telling me that Africa really do not have history. If there is history, what is the proof? Mm-hmm. That is what this guy told me. I feel like I want to cry. Mm-hmm. I'm not a historian, but just thinking ordinary common sense, you could understand. Come on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think something you said very early in this interview is something that's very important. We put too much of a focus, too much energy, too much resource into trying to get others to understand who we are, and not enough in and bringing about a renaissance amongst ourselves, So you can't really, you can teach people and teach them until you're blue, right? About African history and all these things. But it would never make people truly respect you because you don't have power. This is what it comes down to. It comes down to a matter of power. Now, part of power is history, is the control over your own history and historical circumstances. But that control starts with you. That control starts with your group. It starts with your culture. It starts with your people. And once you have a great enough consensus amongst your people of who they are, what's their cultural background, what is the variations in their cultural background, and how those variations and those differences overlap and make for a stronger, more united Pan-African people, things like that. Once you have that, what my mentors, Dr. Malefikete Asante and Ama Mazama would say, Dr. Ama Mazama would say, once you have that, once you have consciousness amongst people, then you can move on to states of unity in various areas: economics, social unity, political unity, those kinds of things. Build an autonomous, not something that's dependent upon various organizations and various people and their empathy and their pity. And autonomy is something that you build yourself and you're able to hold on to on your own, not from the protection of others. Once you build that, you're respected, okay? Because you're on an equal playing field, and you then have the power to define, as Kwame Ture would say, to define and then make others accept your definition of who you are.
That is a very important thing to pay attention to. All right, now, looking at proof, like I was saying before, say maybe, for example, your student who have always have the mainstream media as a source of information now come to the conclusion that really Africans have no history. And this student happen to be in your class and is asking you a proof of the historicity of Africa. Okay, I know this is a very generic thing. I'm putting the whole of Africa in context here. So in this case, Evo, what would you say?
To prove the history of Africa?
Yeah.
And you're saying this is someone of African descent asking me this?
Yeah.
One of the first things I would say is go ask your mother. Go ask your father. Go ask your grandmother. Start with your history. What is your family history? Because that is the history of Africa. What you are, the sum total of how you got here, where you are in this world, those little things make up what history is and what African history is and what a people's history is. So you need to start to, a lot of children in this day and age, they don't talk to their grandparents. Many of them don't know them, right? Or some of them, their grandparents are so young that they don't really have, elders perspective to give to them. But I encourage children, particularly of African descent, to go back as far as you can in your generational tree to whoever's the oldest person living and talk with them about your own particular family history, because the rest of history, the rest of African history, as African American history, history of the Caribbean or on the continent, none of that is really going to make sense to you unless you have a personal connection to it. Okay. So if you tell me that you don't have a history, then I say, you're a lie, because, your history's today, just today, as you woke up, you brushed your teeth and you came to school and, those kind of things. But ask your parents what they went through, what they experienced in life. And then you will start to get a sense of, well, people must have history and we must have done things because we're doing them now. we're making history, we're creating history today, right now. So it would start to click in people that that's a nonsensical idea to have, that there was no history in Africa, because the Western world refuses to either acknowledge it, and you're trapped in this Western educational paradigm. But it generally helps people once they start with themselves and they start with their own family, to kind of for it to click in them that, okay, that's a ridiculous notion that that my ancestors had no history.
What should we use as material to validate the conversation? Say maybe books and things like that in terms of our history.
So one very good history book on the history of Africa is called The History of Africa: The Quest for Harmony. And that was written by Malefikete Asante. Dr. Malefikete Asante is currently in his third edition. I actually assisted on the third edition of this text. So I know that, personally, that it's a very good text for people to use, particularly those of African descent who want to really understand their own history. Dr. Asante, by the way, he's called the father of Afrocentricity. He developed the term Afrocentricity and the ideological paradigm behind it. So he uses this, of course, throughout the text. Toyin Falola has some very good books that I enjoy, that I feel, particularly from Nigerian perspectives, that he tries to put in. I mean, and when I say very good books, I mean he's probably the most published African scholar in the world right now. But he has some things that I feel is helpful. There's only one, maybe two Africanists, which Africanists are largely people who come out of the field of history and maybe anthropology, some but largely white people from either Britain or whatever, that have tried to make some good in terms of presenting history that is truer to African perspective, although they have many errors. But a few that I can think of is the works of Basil Davison, Graham Connor, and Kevin Shillington. But as far as Afrocentrists or Africologists is what I myself call myself, not a historian, not a Africanist, but an Africologist, which is a term that was born out of the field of Black studies, and it has its own disciplinary understanding. It's not an interdisciplinary thing. It's something that, as an Africologist, I believe that we should view all African phenomena from the perspective of African people. And even when dealing with various data from different fields, you have to reinterpret that data Afrocentrically, remove the Eurocentric interpretations out of it. So from the field that produces Africologists, you have, of course, Asante, who I mentioned before, the works of Ama Mazama. Dr. Ama Mazama wrote the Afrocentric Paradigm, which is not a history book, but it uses historical circumstances and ideologies to try to help people to understand how to think Afrocentrically, so that when you're reading other things that deals with African history and African people, you can start to tease out the Eurocentric notions in the things that you're reading and really understand what's going on in that scholarship.
So when you were much younger, tell me about that one. What kind of book were you having access to? So that, of course, when you read, when you have an idea, you need some material to sort of validate it, to test it, to see if what you think is somebody else also thinking about it. In this sense, maybe somebody have written about it. So I'm trying to understand in your days, because even before your time, people have also be writing. So, but I don't know how much really has been written and how much is available for people to consume. So help me with that.
So when I was a child,
Yeah,
what was
yeah,
I reading?
yeah.
So when I was a child, I read some of everything. But it was mostly things from white scholars, because that was the education system I was in. So if not white scholars, but white fiction writers and things of that nature. So my mother, I don't remember this, of course, but but my mother claims that I did not like to read when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, just starting to read. So she started me off with things like Goosebumps, and I don't know if you've heard of that, but the Boxcar Children and stuff like that. And she would read a book. She would get two of the same book, and she would read one copy, and I would read the other, and we would see who could finish it the fastest and be able to talk about the most about what all was occurring in that. I do remember that. I do remember doing that exercise with her, but I don't remember not liking to read. As far as I remember, I always liked to read. So, I read a bunch of those types of books, a lot of fiction books, a lot of books in science. I loved science. When I was in middle school, I thought I was going to be, thought I was very
Scientist.
interested. Yeah, I thought I was very interested in physics and astrophysics, So, when I was in middle school, Neil deGrasse Tyson was kind of a hero of mine, because, he was a lone Black man in this field that was challenging a paradigm, which was that there are not 9 planets, there are 8, that Pluto is not a planet. And he was receiving a whole lot of, hate because of that. And I loved him for it, And so, although he has said in some interviews, I feel that he wasn't one that robbed Pluto. He just drove the getaway car. That's why he puts it. But but so I read a lot of those types of things. I read a lot of fiction that gave me a really good imagination. Fiction is very good. People think that you should only focus on nonfiction, and I think no, fiction is very good. There's a good series out now that's an Afrocentric series, or a series that focuses on African people in fiction. It's called Children of Blood and Bone, that I enjoy. And so so fiction is good, although I don't read much fiction now. But I read very young something that I had to learn later, was from a person that's actually in the more of the scholarly realm, which was W.B. Du Bois. But I read some of his fiction when I was young, particularly a story called The Comet. And so, fiction is very important. But, to understand history itself, when I got into high school, I may have started to focus more on history. And particularly because I was in this history class that, and I went to all Black high school, or historically Black high school, I should say. But the history teacher, this particular history teacher, was a white man who was taught history, of course, from very, very white perspective. And I would have issues, I would have problems in this class. And so I would start to read things outside of the class, other historical things, to try to really understand what was going on here. So I read A People's History of the United States for the first time in high school by Howard Zinn, which kind of presents this history of the United States from the perspectives of everyday people, instead of from the history of those who are in power. And then I read They Came Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett, forgive me, which was a history of enslavement in this country, and people coming to the United States. Or people being brought to the United States, African people, and the whole dynamics of what it meant to be a person who's enslaved and then looking for citizenry after enslavement, the bifurcation between the North and the South in terms of by 1830, the North was virtually, not completely, but virtually free, and the South, still had a slaveocracy. So those kind of things I started to read. I started to read more things by Black writers, Black poets. Langston Hughes, of course, was top of the list for that. Claude McKay, things by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And then I found this one historian. I liked Du Bois, but who I liked more was Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson, who focused a lot on African history, and really had this idea that the Western Academy and even historically Black colleges focuses entirely on the history of the West and of the Teuton, as he called Europeans, or those of more Germanic descent. That's an old word for Germanic peoples, of Teuton. And he said, but not enough on that of the African, and viewing things from from African history and looking at African language and things of that nature. And he wrote this in a little book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And that changed my life. That might have been 10th grade when I was in high school. From there, I went on to read things like the autobiography of Malcolm X and other things like that. My senior year in high school, I was given a little book that was called The Afrocentric Idea. And I had no idea what I was reading when I was reading it, because it was, to me, it was very convoluted. It was full of all these different theories and ideas and all this stuff. But it was the Afrocentric Idea written by Molefi Asante. And so it took me some years to have to come back to that book to understand. But what helped me come back to it is by my last years in college, I was given another book by Asante called The Afrocentric Manifesto. And this one was in more simple terms, and it really explained what Afrocentricity is, what it means to have African agency, what was, African perspectives, and what does it mean to be dislocated, and, all these different things, and what has been the history of people attacking the field of Africana studies or Black studies or Africology, as we more like to call it. And what is the history of people attacking Afrocentricity, all these types of things that are being explained in this little book. And then I take that and I go back and I start to apply some of the things he's saying in there to the Afrocentric idea, and things become more clear. What he was saying in the 90s in Afrocentric idea, and what I think in his wisdom, his eldership now, he was able to really compact and make more simple in manifesto. And then a lot of things began to click, reading those books. A lot of things I started to really understand, really the way of the world, and how we've literally been turned upside down in terms of direction. And that's not just, me saying that. When you look at the history of the Nile Valley and the Sudan and Kemet, to them, what we would normally call North today in the Western world was really South. Inner Africa, what we would consider South, was, heading towards what they would consider, the North, or the front of them, right? And so literally, we've been turned upside down by Western interpretation of history.
Are they insignificant? That is just a question, plainly. Are all this manipulation insignificant to us as Africans?
Well, absolutely. Think of this. What's in the North? What's in the North? When people think of the North, they think of Europe. and you think of further, you think of the North Pole where this, silly fat man, that's fat white man with a beard supposedly lives. But this where children are taught, Santa Claus. But you think of people, think of European people and North, and things like North coincide with ideas like above and on top, and what is above you, what is atop you, what is superior. That's all associated with North. That's why De Sousa Santos, he calls his book The Epistemologies of the South. What is below that we're pulling from and then making, rebranding, in Eurocentric fashion. And that's important because that has psychological manipulation and power and control over people who consider themselves below, who consider themselves the South.
Because, of course, the whole argument turned around to where it was before now, that we need to see it from our point of view. Mm-hmm. I don't need to see it from your point of view. I need to see it from, because my North might not necessarily be your North. It depends on where am I looking. Mm-hmm. So I think now the European or the West, actually, they are forcing us to see reality through their eyes, through their lenses. Mm-hmm. I think that is where we are suffering, because you cannot see reality through another person's lens. It's not possible.
I call it the Eurocentric masquerade. I call it the Eurocentric masquerade. It's a masquerade. It's a veil of what is supposed to be universal, universally accepted, universal ideas, standard, their yardstick, their what metric that is standard to Europe is supposedly applicable to all the other people in the world, but it's only made applicable that way because of European domination, because of colonialism, because of imperialism. So that is a veil, that's a masquerade that people have been, it's like wool over your eyes, that you're being fooled to only see the European or Eurocentric perspective, when some of us innately know that we have our own perspectives, our own ways, but because of the power dynamic, you're almost brainwashed, or you're really mentally enslaved by white validation to validate what is European over your own.
And that simple thing that you said can actually be taken out and expanded and expanded. The West have established what is right. But now, let's look at it this way. Let's say that is what is right according to the West. But that is not necessarily mean that is what is right according to the world. Because the West is not the world. The West is just a small part of the world. But the way they make it appear in the politics, the mainstream media, and all of it, they make it appear that if it is established in Rome, it's established in Washington, it's established in Paris, that is universal. No, it is not universal. That is the European, the Western idea.
Absolutely.
So, but we need to be courageous to contest this sometime, that, I accept it, that is your view, but I have my own view too. All right, now, I want to ask you, when you look at because you list all the books that you have read. In fact, I was really amazed by it. Okay, it's understood. You are a lecturer, you're a professor in this area, no? Now, when you look at the children that are growing up today, because this is where we are going to make the joke. We are going to have to read. There is no two ways about it. If you want to know, you are going to have to do the work. How do you look at their reading culture today?
Children's reading culture today?
Yeah.
There barely is one. That's just being quite frank. Reading is not something that is given a lot of attention. People look at screens a lot, video games and things of this nature. And I was born in the era of video games. I know a lot about, spending hours in front of, trying to figure out puzzles and things of that nature. But I still, very much love to read, and reading was something that was celebrated in my home. It had to be. My grandfather was a history teacher, so those who read, maybe sometimes jokingly, you'll be, it's like, oh, you're reading that big thick book over there, but it was still kind of this notion of pride and like, okay, that's, you're going to be somebody. You keep reading that, you keep reading anything you put your hands on. And so, but today I don't see it as much. And I don't see, when I used to sub, I was a substitute teacher in grade schools. And when I would talk to parents, I would get, some kind of like, yeah, that person really needs to, that my son or daughter really needs to buckle down. I'm like, well, you're their parent. Buckle them down. Sit them in a corner, and make them read. I recall when I was in middle school, my mother would take me to school quite a few mornings. She would always take me to school on a morning I had an exam. And I would be, but she would put out all the study material and make me read it all over again on the way to school, because we had an hour ride, 30 to 45 minutes to get to my school, right? So she would make me read all the material over again on the way. I'd be falling asleep trying to, because it's 6 a.m, and I'm a kid, but she would, slap me on the leg and say, hey, wake up and read, wake up. Yeah. And it was clever what she was doing, because I had no escape. I was in a car with her. I had no choice but to do what she told me to do. And those kinds of things, I just don't think are being done. Sitting down and making sure. But part of the problem perhaps is because of, at least in America, the way capitalism has spurned to the degree that a lot of parents don't have time anymore. Some are working 2 and 3 jobs. My mom, she was fortunate to only have to work 1 job, right? But some are working a lot of jobs and they have to stay late hours and they can't put in the time that's necessary with their kids anymore. And some would argue that that's perhaps by design, the disintegration of the educational system here, and people not being able to really to put in their time resource for their children.
That is interesting. Anyway, I will leave that for another conversation, because that also is very important. The children, the education, and the system, what the system wants, because they are configuring the head of the children based on a certain program. They have their own program for what they want, Anyway, that is another day. Now, for somebody, maybe an adult or a young woman or a young boy who want to start reading about Africa in a way to really understand African history, what would you recommend for this individual? Maybe for 3 books to read, or where should this person start from?
Just for a young person, I think, trying to read a whole history of the continent would be a little too daunting. Perhaps start with an individual, someone that you might feel like you just enjoy or you like. If you've learned maybe a little bit about Mansa Musa, find a book on Mansa Musa. If you learn something about Queen Nzinga, find a book on Nzinga, or a book on any individual, even if it's I don't know, Mandela or someone of even in contemporary society. Find an individual, or perhaps a place. If you liked what you saw about Zimbabwe, find a small book on Zimbabwe. Learn what you can about that particular person or place or event in history, and expand from there. Find something that connects to it. So if you learned about the civilizations or the Sudanic civilizations, maybe start with a little area like Borno, or start with Timbuktu, and then expand to what was the Ghana Empire like, and then what was Mali and Songhai, what were they like? but start off small and then start to expand so you can build on previous knowledge that you already have.
Now, at this moment, we usually give it to our audience to connect better. Perhaps you have a book there that you are selling, or a course, or a way that you can connect with the audience. Please go ahead and tell people how to connect with you.
I have a media website or kind of venture that I'm creating called the Africologist. So right now there's a website. You can go to www.theafricologist.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram. Also on Twitter, and you can connect with me through that platform.
Another thing I'm sort of finding very interesting now is, like I was saying in the beginning, the connection. Now, in the time past, we could say we didn't have the possibility of connecting. So, okay, we could listen to others who just throw blunders everywhere, that they see Africa have a tail. Okay, they have a tail like the monkey. They are speaking gibberish. Nobody understands them. We don't even know where they came from. They are alien. That is for them in those days. But this is 2022. There is internet. So, as a university lecturer, do you have any type of collaboration with African University in terms of validating data, exchanging knowledge, and all that?
No, I don't have any connections with the university as an institution. I do have connections with various people who work at universities. You're asking about universities on the African continent, right?
Yeah.
I do
or
have
maybe a scholar with whom you are exchanging ideas, because we need to.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Can you share anything like that? What do you do? Is it like a kind of a forum? How is it beneficial to you? Is this something we need to encourage? What is the benefit of such connection today?
Yeah, we should definitely encourage it. And like I said, I don't have a connection with institutions themselves, but different individuals, different professors who may or may not want me to pull their name into the conversations on air. But we have general discussions, talks. We look over each other's work, things of that nature. And I find it very beneficial. It's always going to be beneficial dealing with your own people, and also from various parts of the African world, because it's not just on the African continent. I know people in the Caribbean in certain institutions, people in other parts of in European countries who also benefit from discussion and looking at their work, and perhaps soon some of us are going to develop some media content that people can start looking at on an international scale.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, because you made mention of the agency before, no? So in my little way, I was just looking at it now like agency, like a kind of a physical place, or these days online, everything is done online now. Mm-hmm. A kind of cross-continental forum of sharing. Is this something like that you are thinking as agency to share African knowledge? Or if not, how can building a platform like that where African come to share knowledge can be of value in restructuring our history?
Mm-hmm. There's this one platform, Abimi Tumi, being held out of Ghana by Obadeli Kambon. And I think that's, it's a wonderful platform. He has all kinds of things on there, and people can, reach out to him and find out what kind of stuff that you can share, because he has like a TV type of platform, a YouTube channel, and all kinds of things like that. And I think things like that are essential. We have to have control over not just the media that's being put out, but the ways of distribution, right? YouTube can decide tomorrow to take all of their content that has anything to do with Africa off of there, or anything that you're saying. They can decide, just take it off. Where is our own, Africa too? where is, things that we have control over to distribute information that needs to be distributed. And then also, the creation of the content itself. And creating content, I would say that it could be rather simple. People do it all the time. If you have things like TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that, people create little videos and put various information out there. But those are good. That we need the low production things, but we also need high production video content, creatives who have a host of knowledge of producing audio and video and things of that nature, to come together with people with backgrounds in African history and Afrocentric theory and thought and all this kind of stuff, and produce a lot of very good content, high quality content for people to imbibe. Because essentially, a lot of the West is the power of the West. If you remove, which is a huge thing to remove, right? But weapons and artillery and things of that nature. If you don't even look at that, they still are very powerful. Why? Because of propaganda. Because you have this one company. I don't know if it's still the case, but I know years ago, perhaps the major company throughout Africa in terms of communications was Viacom, which is an American company, right? And through that, people get I've experienced people coming from the continent having very ridiculous notions about African Americans because some of the ridiculous things that is shown on that programming. But it's all propaganda, right? And you have to have control over propaganda. If you have to have control over media and the way things are presented, the way things are represented, the perspectives that are placed into media content, because if you don't, Hollywood will, right?
And they're not going to do it to your favor.
And they're not, absolutely not. It's going to be completely to a Eurocentric paradigm. It's going to be completely out of Western ethos. And even those of us who try to work within the so-called Hollywood system and produce things, they have trouble. They have backlash. Their funding gets cut. The projects start and they stop, and all kinds of things, because people know very well that creating a host of images and representations of people that the West is trying to exploit, and you create images of themselves as agents within their own history, and agents within their own contemporary society, and actors of on the world stage and things of that nature. Even if it's fiction, even if it's things like Black Panther, which is why, although it grossed $1 billion, for one, it grossed $1 billion for Disney. It didn't gross $1 billion for Black community. It didn't gross $1 billion for people of African descent. People in the African continent and receiving that money. Disney received $1 billion, right? And then the actors received a few, sparse millions. But that's a first thing with that. But when you think of things like Black Panther, there's always the critique that there's some ideas and ideologies that didn't go far enough. There was also too much an emphasis on the West. Who all thought to themselves, I wanted to see more of this fictional African city, this Wakanda. What could have been really done with that? The great ideas and aesthetic and things that could have really been expanded upon and been celebrated within that. But instead, you get this quarter of the movie fight scene in some Western country, and and looking at artifacts. Yeah, it very much is. It very much is, and but that's because we don't control the means of the production or the means of distribution. We just don't control them. and that would change if we get control over them.
That also is another powerful argument to take. But anyway, that also is another time, because that has to do with the money. Because we think we don't have money, but it is not true. The African diaspora community have a lot of billions of dollars. We control. The reason the Europeans are allowed to come here is because they want us to work for them, to feed their machine, which means we are useful. But why don't we also take part of that money to develop the community? Because they're just making it, taking everything away from you. There was something even as horrible as what the British did to Jamaica. I interviewed a guy who was born in Britain 50 years ago. He told me of his parents who came during the wind rush, who the British said they should come to work for them. Now they have grown old. Some of them are still alive. They are deporting some of them because they don't have paper. How can you do that? At old age, where do you want them to work? For crying out loud, that should be a crime. That should be a crime against humanity. All right, that also is another conversation. Now, we really talk about something very important though today, about the history, the importance of history, how it is structured, and most importantly, what we can do as a people to sort of restructure some of the system, because this is the work that essentially is awaiting us. We will do it or it is not done. So to conclude the conversation, what would be your last statement? It could be a message, it could be anything, to sort of conclude it in your own way. Please go ahead.
Well, what you just said, either we do it or it will not be done. Neely Fuller, who the Afro-American intellectual, who's a mentor of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, who was another brilliant intellectual, but he had this saying that no one's coming to save us. You have to do it yourself. And that's, that's always been a very important message for me.
All right, Mr. Taharka, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure from my end.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here.
If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.